گریه‌های بی‌وقفه برای تصویر تکرار این لحظه، برای چهره‌ای که میخنده، برای دانشان تا برای آینده، برای این بهشت اجباری، برای.
Hello and welcome everyone to the Emancipated Citizen Podcast. I am your host, Zac. With me is your other host, Ben, and our guest, Fatma, who is an Iranian activist here in Germany. So let's start with a little bit of background about the situation, how we got here, and basically where we're going, because there's a lot going on in Iran. Arguably, well, there's been a lot going on in Iran for quite a long time. The political situation hasn't been stable for the past century to one degree or another. There have been a lot of different grievances, different groups with different interests. So yeah, let's start with 1979. In 1979, people from different sections of the population went out to the streets to protest all kinds of different injustices or perceived injustices. That included like workers' rights groups, communist groups, people who were against the monarchy and its either real or perceived political repression at the time, and of course religion also played some role in that, although all the significance of that role has been heavily disputed by many different people, or I should say, has been given different levels of significance in hindsight. As the movements on the street grew, the monarch of Iran, the royal family, the Shah, started to make more compromises, and eventually chose to escape the country. His situation was not seen as being very strong. He was seen as weak at the time. People were, in a lot of senses, emboldened by that, and the exiled cleric Ayatollah Khomeini, who has been exiled in France for quite a while, at that point flew back to Iran. There were fears that his plane might be shot down, or that he might not be allowed there, or arrested on site, or whatever. Yeah, at that point, it seemed to everyone that the revolution has been won, has been completed. They have a new leader. Like I said, at the time, was known for very different rhetoric from what he was known for after the revolution, when they started to focus on taking power for the religious establishments. And over time, the religious establishment has been seen to be alienating people more and more, especially with things like veiling mandates in public, and things that Iranians saw as violations of their rights and their freedoms, and things that they simply weren't used to, and didn't see themselves as having signed up for it. And so in that sense, a lot of people kind of felt duped, and especially the coming generation. I think 2-3 generations, however you want to calculate that. This constant and growing feeling of betrayal by the regime. So yeah, I don't want to go too long on this. Just wanted to give a brief overview before I introduce our guest, Fatma Mishidi, who has been involved in political activism, at least here in Germany, who has been very outspoken in condemning the Mullah regime in Iran, its human rights abuses. So, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, Fatma, your background, maybe some of your experiences, your activities in Iran, you viewed this regime growing up and living there, what brought you to leave the country. Yeah, just feel free to speak your mind, introduce yourself, and the work that you have been doing over the last few years.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this podcast. I've been basically active since a while, last 15 years. But if I want to introduce myself a bit, before my activism started, I grew up to 16 in Qom, and then I moved to Tehran to study my BA in Tehran, one of the university in Tehran. And then I moved to America, did my MA in America, and then I back home after a few years. And that was the time that basically in 2006, that was the time that 1 million signature campaign, which was a part of women movement activities. At the time I started basically engage with this campaign, and the campaign was on basically against the discriminatory law against women in within the constitution. And the idea was to change 9 laws, for instance, right to marriage for women, right to divorce, right to custody, child custody, and all this. And basically, we were working, the idea was to collect 1 million signature across Iran and take it to parliament and change the law. But what happened, we faced 2009 Green Movement, and basically after the Green Movement, there was a mass detention of the activists and a long sentence charges. And at that time, I got also in trouble because of my activities working for 1 million signature campaign in Qom, the city of Qom, and the most religious city. And also I was working at...
You're gathering signatures from people in essentially the heart of the religious establishment.
Exactly. So basically, we collected a lot of actually signatures among the family of the clerics, and
that's amazing.
yeah. So, and it seems that the city of Qom, especially at that time, for the Islamic establishment was a resort. It's for them, it's important to have the loyalty of that city. So that was why I got harsh also charges. Most of the activists in this campaign got also detained, but they were released after a short time. But for me, they gave me basically prison term. And it was a punishment that they told me that and also they connected me immediately to my study in US. And so they made a lot of misassumption about my activity and my intention in the city of Qom. And I got 1 year charge, and I spent 6 months. And then after 2 weeks, I was forced to leave the country. And then I moved to Berlin because at the same time, I found a job here and I moved to Berlin.
Okay. So let us.
I have a question about that. When you say forced to leave the country, do you mean you had to flee, or that the government told me you had to leave?
Yeah, the public prosecutor from his office, they called me and asked me to go get my passport and leave the country.
Oh.
And yeah. And before that, while I was in prison and spending my prison term, again, I got the security took me to interrogation again, even though I already had all the interrogation a year before, and I had my court trial and I had my charges. And then They took me again for another file while I was in prison, to another interrogation by the securities, and they told me that you're like coming out of one prison and then going to another file and prison term. So basically, they lay out my situation after release like this. That's why once I got released, I got a call that I should take the passport and leave the country. Otherwise, I would go back again for another fine. And they did to many activists. It wasn't only me. And also one of the things they did, which was not only my case, was they did it to other activists too. They sabotaged my family, and they made a lot of, they knew that part of my family is religious, so they tried to irritate it in this sense against me. And another thing, they stopped my relationship with my fiance, and they asked us to leave the relationship. They force us. And and this is not only they did it to me, they did it to other activists too.
Wow. So, that is rather thoroughly invasive, but
yeah, it's very traumatic. Yeah.
Are they still forcing people to leave instead of imprisoning them, or did they stop forcing people to leave?
At the moment, this is very interesting question. At the moment, the university students going basically for demo and chanting, they say that we would stay, we would not leave the country. We want to take Iran back.
That is absolutely amazing. And it is very curious to me, especially with my background and activists with whom I've been in contact with in Saudi Arabia and that kind of thing. It does seem that with a lot of authoritarian regimes, they try their best to keep those people in their country, to keep them in prisons, to make sure that their voices are not heard by the rest of the world. So it is very new to me and a very curious phenomenon, if I could say so, that the Iranian government would actually encourage dissidents to leave the country where outside the country they would potentially be able to express themselves freely and talk about everything that they have experienced. Would you be able to give any insight of why especially the Iranian authorities behave this way? Is not having enough prison capacities, they're already executing enough people, they're imprisoning enough people, it costs a lot of money, so just go away, we can't afford to punish you anymore? Is that what it's about? Or
at that time, when we talk about like 2011, that situation was different from what we talk now in 2020. Okay, at that time, they didn't have actually where I was arrested on the first place. The security told me that we never had woman political prisoner. We don't know where to put you. We have a place for man political prisoner, and they took me to place where was, even though I was not able to see, I was blindfolded, so I could see we were underground, and I could also, like, later I learned that was apparently a seminary school. It was underground basement of woman seminary school, and next to it was children, girls school children, because during day I would hear they were screaming, playing in the yard, so I could hear them. Okay, so, and also that basement was a prison for, basically they would detain man political prisoners. So when I arrived, I remember I could hear someone was basically knocking the wall to give message to me. And then when I not responded, the security came and took him and started beating him, and I could hear his scream.
Let me clarify something, because I'm not entirely clear on this. Did they take you to like, did they lock you up in a basement of a women's seminary school, or did they take you to a men's prison?
It was that was seminary school, the whole building. It was women's seminary school. At the same time, they would use the securities in Rome. I know they use a lot of actually non-official places to prison the political activists. In a sense that they can do anything they want to it, and nobody can hear, nobody can trace it. That's why they're using non-official buildings.
That sounds like Argentina when they were torturing people inside a Ford factory, among a bunch of other places.
All right, so
and in a cemetery, that explains a lot.
So we were talking about the Green Revolution events from like I guess 2006 to 2009. Could you elaborate and tell us exactly what is the Green Revolution? Where did it start? What was it about? Why did it have that name? Because honestly, like it's something you hear about from time to time. I know it has a lot to do with women's rights, civil rights in Iran. A lot of people went to prison. There was a lot of government repression. I have to admit, I don't know exactly what that is. So, are you able to explain that to us?
Okay, Green Movement was a political movement in a sense that the whole, the election happened between basically the reformist part of the state and Ahmadinejad, and Ahmadinejad's team as a hardline group at that time represent themselves. And what happened, the state manipulate the election procedure, even though Ahmadinejad did not have enough vote, took the power. And the slogan of this movement was, "Where is my vote?" So the people poured to the street, loaded. For instance, there was one day on the street of Tehran, and most of the major cities at that time, Green Movement people came to the street. It was like a city of Tehran, the most were active. Like in one day, 3 million people came to a street, and they had silence march, And the reason they called Green Movement, because their also anthem was this green thing that was referred to, a flag that was referred to basically their leading. At that time, Green Movement had leaders, and the leaders were the reformist part of the state people like Mousavi and Karoubi, and they got also since then they got house arrest. But when we talk about so the Green Movement concept is totally different from what you have as a revolution now. So because the Green Movement was basically the protesters mostly were middle class people, came to the street, and the slogan. The slogan was clear. It was why the fraud? What happened to our vote? So this is, and at that time, I believe as a woman activist, because the 1 million signature campaign and the woman movement in general were very active. But when Green Movement in 2009 happened, basically the whole women activism were under the political movement as a bigger movement, because the political movement was actually had a bigger agenda, and in patriarchy system, this is how it happens. Woman issues goes usually on the minor, on the margin when political things comes up. So this is what it happened. But also the state, basically what they stated at that time to woman movement and to woman activists is stop all these NGOs running by women in entire Iran. And that was really basically turn off for the woman activism, because they either had to go to prison, the state sentenced them to long-term prison, or they had to leave the country, someone like me. And this is what it happened at that time. So many women were active at that time. They flee Iran and they came to Europe and North America. And those who remain in Iran, they had to go underground or go to a prison.
How difficult was it to work in like NGOs or organizations or initiatives for women's rights and empowering women, that kind of thing? Was that I get the impression that it was at least possible before 2009, but I don't imagine it was very easy. Was it? Can you give us some examples of like organizations that operated and did some good work before those events, or individuals who became victims to the crackdown that happened during or after the Green Revolution? Or
Well, before Green Movement, basically the NGOs who were running by women in different basically activities, the reason they could work to some extent because the reformist part of the state were it was the part of the state controlling this part of civic society that is developing. Okay, so basically they would work according to the state regulation, and they were not able to cross the red line. And cross the red line for the state was not going over Sharia, not going over Islamic regulation, So that's how a women movement started working, which was very short also period. That was the time I left Iran. I usually go to Iran during the bad time, hardliner governing. So at that time, a little basically newborn civic society in different area. I mean, women activism, for instance, one of the campaign was on stop stoning women. This is one of the basically punishment for women if women act beyond marriage, having affair beyond marriage institution,
this
Islamic
demanded also kind of goes against the Sharia, right? Like,
exactly that kind of thing. So there was a few basically a woman campaign running by these NGOs in different cities and of course major cities, and mostly the youth were active in this. So for a short time they had this to develop basically these NGOs, and then but it was short because and then also many newspapers born at that time critical to some extent against the state and bringing up women issues, youth issues, things like that, and human rights issues developed. But it was all temporary, It didn't go long. And then when Green Movement happened, all these little short made things stopped because the state basically cut all the budgets. And what some of the NGOs did, or what some of these activists underground tried to replace, to make as an alternative, was they started charity NGOs. And under this title of charity NGOs, they would do secret women activities. Again, it was mostly on basically, going to different area, working on woman issues. And when we speak of woman issues, it's like, femicide. It's on every detail things of everyday life of women that you have to really work on it. And they were doing it. But again, all these underground alternative activities, again, got cut by the state because some of these NGOs money came from outside, and that's why the state stopped them. And again, those who got caught, those activists got caught, again, got long-term sentences. This is basically what is going on with civil society since like 2009, a bit before and after, up to now.
no.
But again, I have to say that even though the restriction was growing by the state over NGOs and over civic society, there was a lot of activities. This deprivation, this social deprivation, political deprivation for civil society brought up a lot of creativities by activists itself, those who remain underground. And for instance, you have, since I left Iran, which is August 2011, we have environmental activists that we didn't have before. We have teachers union became activists last 2-3 years, 3-4 years. We have workers union that they are very active.
Were those things that were tolerated by the state at the time?
No, but well, no, none of these civic society activism all been tolerated by the state.
It's more of a situation where the state is kind of overwhelmed and doesn't have the resources to go after them all. So
exactly, you know, basically the Islamic regime became more conscious how to cut the source of power and how to govern. How to use this term, to basically totalitarianism regime grow, from the beginning. It wasn't like this. When you look at 1979, the Islamic establishment detained and killed 4,000 political prisoners who come from different political branches, okay? And that was also, basically removing a source of human resources, a powerful human resources. And that was also a strong fear for the whole society, right? But it's still, from one, people had home gathering, underground gathering, those who remain activists from 1979 to work together until Khatami's time. And then they started with basically these activists remain to negotiate with part of the state as a reformist, again, to rebuild themselves according to the state regulation. But since Ahmadinejad, all those gone,
I'm sure some people might be asking ourselves why we, up till this point, haven't gotten to events of this year and the pollution that's happening right now. I did want to cover as the background behind it in terms of civil society, in terms of government and education and lobbying groups and all the relevant factors before we get to the current episode of where we are right now. And one thing that you and I, Fatima, have off air, like before we got on this podcast, talked about was kind of the unique situation that Iran has right now in terms of the power that that civil society has, and the fact that people are able to effectively communicate on a political level. They have some of the necessary structures to make decisions together. You can put that in contrast to a country like Syria or Saudi Arabia, like I probably alluded to before. And I think yeah, I think you have given us a very thorough background here when it comes to the organizations that started building in 1979, the organization that were built and kind of supported by this reformist part of the government in the early 2000s, and the fact that despite government repression, this civil society infrastructure, so to speak, has never really gone away. Is that something that's applied back in 1979, or would you say, like, maybe it's not a fair question, maybe it's not your historical background, so answer this if you feel comfortable answering it. But do you think that one of the main problems in 1979 was that this civil society infrastructure and this effective means of political communication and common decision making didn't exist, and so essentially the toughest motherfucker out there, namely Ayatollah Khomeini, ended up being on top?
I think when we speak of 1979, even though I at that time I was 5-6 years, okay, so I believe that was totally different socio-political structure, in a sense that at that time you have political parties, you have political communities that they have activities on the ground, they are active in universities, they active in school children, girls, boys. Many people, many of those activists got killed by the Iranian state in later. They actually school years, they very young also. I believe when we're talking about 1979, we are talking about secular monarchy that led the political parties to some extent work, but also at the same time has a lot of restriction on the left, but then let the religious activism grow. This is the situation at that time. And
so essentially the monarchy kind of allowed those religious organizations to organize and grow, and on the other side, like leftists and Democrats and liberals, especially I guess the threat of republicanism was kind of repressed much more than the others, and so in the end you end up with only one organized force, namely the Islamists there, and that was a major contributing factor to the tragic way that its revolution, that events in 1979 ended up happening. Am I covering this correctly? Do you have anything
well,
to it, or?
well, I need to add that you need to consider in global world system order was basically East and West at that time, okay?
Yeah.
And this anti-imperialist, which means anti-American imperialist phenomena at that time was very strong in the global sense, in political global sense. And basically, this wave of political Islam grew during this time in Iran and the whole region, coming out of this fight between East and West. But now we're just focusing on Iran because we want to also speak of the current revolution.
Yeah. So speaking about the current revolution,
excuse me to stop you. I think Ben had a question, no?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, going
back.
back to when you're talking about different kinds of civil society, do any of them, especially the environmental activists, end up clashing with the Revolutionary Guard because of the Revolutionary Guard's ownership of so much for the Iranian economy? And, well, I wouldn't be surprised if they cut corners on environmental protection.
The environmental activism grew since, I would say, last years, and after 2011. And you're right. I mean, when basically environmental activism started growing in Iran, so they were working on different, basically, environmental infrastructure, and which conflict the interest of the Revolutionary Guard. During this time, the Revolutionary Guard took over part of Iran in terms of economic infrastructure, even the forest, even the mountains. You cannot believe that. So they started in a sport everywhere. So the Revolutionary Guard were basically everywhere in this sense. So it's obvious that would conflict with the interest of, also environmental activism. And they accuse some of these environmental activists being agent of Israel, being agent of America, being agent of Saudis. So some of the leader, like, I don't know if you heard, one of them actually got killed by the state while he was in prison.
I wish I could say I was surprised, but everyone's environmental activists always seem to be the agent of their enemy country, at least according to the people who are polluting in some way or another.
Yeah.
We could go into a rabbit hole about how little state-owned companies, especially, I imagine, military-owned companies, don't care about the environment, but that's really not why we're here today. What's happened in the U.S. is any indication. I wouldn't be surprised if Revolutionary Guard-owned businesses are lackadaisical about what they do.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a very important point that brings us. Yeah, I guess the main point of today's topic, namely what's part current events, the mass protests, the conflict between state forces and protesters, and the increasing violence. The media has over the past few months been, and a lot of people on the ground as well, very much presenting this situation right now as beginning with the murder of Kurdish young woman Mahsa Amini for supposedly not wearing her headscarf correctly, or after being arrested for not wearing her headscarf correctly. But as we can see it, like from the things that we talked about before, those violations, the prisoners being tortured, being killed, activists made to disappear, expelled out of the country, so on and so forth. There have been, and yeah, I've been following news from Iran during this period, having to do talking about women wanting to be able to view sports, be in sports stadiums, being violently held back by state forces. How that has sporadically and increasingly less sporadically incited protests around the country. And as this case with Mahsa Amini came out, I think the recording had a certain video recording had a certain part to do with it. One has seen that the protests aren't sporadic as one would describe them before. They're happening very regularly and on more and more frequent basis. Was there anything special about the case of Mahsa Amini that was so inspirational? Or was it just a tipping point of one of a list of many violations against people, at which point people are just decide that they have had enough? And so yeah, I don't want to go too deep into it because you probably have better background about it, Fatma, about the story of Mahsa Amini, the protests that were inspired after that, how the case developed there.
For the case of Mahsa Amini, Mahsa Amini, I think it is important to, we had this couple years back to Uprising that also suppressed severely, violently by the state over increasing gas price, and also this basically shutting, the Iranian airplane going to Canada. So these two was on like last year's state did really, and that was done also by IRGC, Revolutionary Guards. And also people came to know what they state, how they state spend people's money in Syria, killing children, families in Syria, in basically for its political ambitions, in making Shia militia in Lebanon, what is the Iranian state doing in Lebanon, in making real estate in Latin America, and the cost of basically making the Iranian people poor and poor and poor, and beside removing violently the civic society, all these factors was on the background. Plus, since Raisi came over, they started they started making more restriction on women in public sphere, in a sense that, for instance, 2-3 months before Gina's murdering, we have other people, other women, young women get caught on the bus by state women, by those women working within the state on the issue of hijab. That and this circulated basically largely via social media. And this violence against women over just hijab that been going on for 40 years, for decades, basically brought the family of this young woman to the scene, and stopping the police on the street not bothering their children. I believe the role of media, social media, improving and basically growing social media is very important in what we want to discuss in women revolution in Iran. For instance, as I told you, they did what they did, for instance, to this woman, Sepide Rashno, who was caught on the bus by one of these women over hijab, and they put her on TV for forced confession. This created a lot of discontent. This basically irritated the whole population over these hijab things, while people suffering from poverty, not having enough money to feed their family, the state basically put young women on TV and getting confession over just showing a few strand of hair. That's it. That's ridiculous. That means you're making ridiculous the whole population. And so everybody expect more or less there would be a mass movement, mass uprising. But what happened, what is inspiring by murdering this Kurdish young girl, is that there is a strong political background and woman activity background in Kurdistan that is missing in the narration of the current revolution when people discussing it, and we should keep highlighting it and talking about it, because that would impact basically on women revolution in a large extent, meaning that the political parties in Kurdistan, these two political parties, Komole and Democrat, they are very strong in Kurdistan region. And always the state try to keep them down, to suppress them, to kill them, to target them. But they have a strong resistance since 1979. But when we come to the current revolution, what is significant is that anything happens to women in Kurdistan, the families would be on the street, the families would support immediately, okay? So what happened to Gina, the Kurdish families in Sanandaj, in her hometown city of Sanandaj, and other cities, they all raise up, they all basically came to a street. And that was a sparking moment for the rest of the youth that were on fire already, ready for such a moment. And they came to the street. And that was this fearless Kurdish, basically activism in the region gave courage to the youth, to the rest of Iran. And this is how you also see it different from uprising a few years ago, from 2009 Green Movement, and before that. And in a sense that this time the revolution, the movement, the protest, the uprising began from Kurdistan, the most repressed region of Iran. Whereas you see the other uprising all mostly started from capital city of Tehran.
Yeah, and it's very inspiring to see the Iranian people standing with this minority and their demands to the right, and all of that.
The meeting.
And thanks for covering this. This to this whole situation. One thing that you also notice, the name Mahsa or Gina Amini. I have heard that Kurdish names, Kurdish culture, Kurdish holidays, that kind of thing is very heavily repressed in Iran, and for that reason, people like her do end up having like an Iranian official name and a Kurdish name that.
For more than 4 decades, the Kurdish political parties were under pressure and all kind of pressure. And one of the things the state did to this part is that they cannot pick up Kurdish name in their identity card, So that's why Gina, her original name was Gina, but on the identity card had to be something Persian. And if any teacher teaches Kurdish language to the kids, would get arrested too. So there are a lot of all kind of repression on this region.
Is there a logic behind that you can speak to, like something to do with Islam or shirk or whatever?
The most, I think, important reason behind this is that the Iranian state want to give this assumption, this fake image assumption that can be the state is centralized and has authority over all part of Iran. And even though we have a lot of diversity in Iran, we have the Kurds, the Turk, the Baluch, the Arab. So the state stop all these diversity languages to be taught, to be trained in official school, because it wants to apply the central authority. But, there was always resistance from civic society from the ground.
Yeah, and I imagine that a lot of aspects of Kurdish culture feed that. One of my Kurdish friends just told me that the position of women in Kurdish society, he was an Iraqi Kurd, so it's a slightly different situation, but that women were so much more respected that Kurdish women would not marry Arab men, but Arab women would sometimes marry Kurdish men, just because of that. And that for a long time, I think particularly Arab commentators, he didn't specify, said that women were basically like men in Kurdistan, will also play a role.
In a sense of being strong, in a sense of that they were able to basically build a powerful resistant group that they can, they politically also active, they have opinion. Yeah, you're right. They could overcome many of this repression that run by the state, but because they already have a political party, they can organize, mobilize people. In Kurdistan, if a political party say that today, tomorrow, everybody has to be on a strike, they go on a strike immediately. So they're able to organize and mobilize people. And that's why the state always target their headquarters in Erbil, Iraqi part.
Yeah, it's leading to all sorts of interesting scenarios. But yeah, I heard that the Iranian government is now launching attacks into Iraqi Kurdistan, claiming there's a connection there. Although you'd know better than me, but it does not sound like most of the protests in Tehran are being organized from Iraqi Kurdistan.
You mean in terms of organizing the protest? Of course, in the rest of Iran it's different. You always have to also keep in mind that the state has so much power in terms of like military and other aspect in the center, in capital, in central provinces. But the provinces on the border, west, east, south, north, it's different. Their situation is different because when everywhere, every province that the state do not have power, then this is their social group that has power. Social group meaning that if it's tribal, if it's urban social group, if it's political group, like Baluchi, they go by their own taife, ashire, their own traditional social group. In also Arab Khuzestan is the same. So they say do not have much power in general on the border side of the on the border side of the societies in Iran. And so that's why also like how the protesters, you see how the protesters organize themselves in city of Tehran, in major cities like Isfahan, Mashhad, small cities also around the center are different from the rest of the Iran. So it's more local, meaning that neighborhood to neighborhood via their own network, the youth also using digital, this social media, they call for every day that people should come to the street or where to protest. It's all organized like this. So this is how it's different. Whereas in Balochistan, for instance, the Friday prayer organize basically every protest on Friday. And this is how people collect. In Khuzestan is different, the Arab part. In Kurdistan, the call for protests coming to a street or a strike also calling by their own political party. So every pieces of Iran organized protests according urban social structure, its own urban social structure.
And
and
what
I've
I
heard
find very encouraging about all of this is that the majority Persian population is very much standing in solidarity with all the minorities that are fighting for representation, right? At least for the time being. So that is incredibly encouraging to see that this government has so far failed in dividing its people based on ethnicity.
And I have also heard that a lot of, I guess, particularly Persian nationalists are also very much against Kurdistan or Baluchistan leaving.
Well, at the moment, one thing that is very unique for this current revolution is that because during last, let's say 10 years, 15 years, the opposition groups outside Iran were not able to make a solid alternative in order to basically topple down the regime and make a solid alternative state or possible political state. What happened, it was a basically examination, practicing time that people brought up all their differences or their basically disagreement. And when this revolution happened, because it started from women, it's the big motive is woman issues, and it led by women. This time, all these differences, all these diversities, all the social diversity, all these political division, they came together, they became united. And this is very unique at this moment, the last 3 months. So when I go to a street, for instance, in Berlin, when I go to protest, I have on my side mujahideen, monarchies, lefties, all kind of division of all these groups. So people keep telling each other that we have to be tolerant. Inside Iran, now all these even nationalists became united. So they don't care when the massacre last 2 weeks, massacre of the Kurdish people started last 2 weeks in Kurdistan. The people, it happened at night. So people in Tehran poured to a street, and they started at night in the middle of night. They started coming to a street and show their solidarity to the Kurdish. When things happened in the massacre happened in basically in a Friday prayer a few weeks back in Baluchistan in Zahedan, the state killed 90 people in one day. People all came to in Tehran and other cities. So basically this time there is a large solidarity among people from different backgrounds, no matter what, Arab or Kurd or any minorities. This time they think that only being united together we are able to topple down the regime. That's the key.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely true, and I guess there is a certain amount of anxiety. Let's hang this one topic for later at the end. Yeah, it seems like with increasing frequency of the protests, those things having their echoes in places like Berlin, where last month or like just over a month ago, there was a mass protest in the middle of Berlin where tens of thousands showed up, where the streets were so full of people that our phones stopped working essentially because the towers were overburdened, and so many Iranians, more than possibly more people than I've ever seen in one place, except maybe in Mecca, and such a large number of them were Iranians, and it was so emotional. Those people, you could really feel the passion there, and it does give you I guess some people have said it gives a certain feeling of what a what a free Iranian society with free associations might look like in that sense.
But also it was representing a big pressure on the European and North American state, governors who are still in collaboration with the Iranian state to change their mind, because if the Europeans saying that this is a democratic country and people vote for who go to the parliament, then they should also listen and see, what is happening on the street.
Yeah, it's a very, very powerful statement about like coming from the Iranians themselves, that the relationships being held to Iran and the diplomatic recognition, all of that is no longer justified, and that European governments should be standing by the side of the Iranian people and no longer recognizing this as legitimate government, no longer having those diplomatic relationships, right? And I think the Iranian people have made their opinion on this issue abundantly clear, with full knowledge of what economic consequences and all of that might bring with it. The way that things are, it simply cannot continue. And also incredibly promising, it seems that in a lot of situations the tables have turned when it comes to the interactions between regular people and like religious police, the morality police, and all of that. As far as I understand it, the morality police, the CG, right? They like before it was like everybody's afraid of them. They could take people's car like number plates and things like that, and like they were untouchable. And it seems that recently they like people have been so emboldened to fight back and protect themselves, and like some of those people in the meantime were also beaten up and killed, and it's no it seems like it's become such an unsafe working environment for them, and completely justifiably so, that the Iranian government decided to abolish this, or at least officially abolish the morality police. So they're not officially going out on the street and harassing women. So that is incredibly promising. Here's for hoping for more good news out of Iran. It's wonderful that the people's movement has affected a lot since the death of Mahsa Amini. A lot of women are no longer hesitant or afraid to leave the house without covering their hair. Even though those laws still exist, they just don't have the power to enforce them anymore. And so that is all incredibly promising. But I do have to ask for the future of Iran. Are you optimistic about how things might develop? Because, like, we talked a lot today about the differences between what's happening today and what happened in 1979, and how, like, so many factors are different that I don't imagine things going the same way, because people learn, people evolve, and all of that. But at the same time, I do have my anxieties, and I think many people inside and outside of Iran do have their anxieties about what happens when the Islamic Republic is no longer there, when the current government falls, when there might be a vacuum of power, or maybe even not, if things are done very effectively, so that the people are immediately able to form an effective government. Like, are you optimistic about how things might look in the future? Like, I don't like predictions, and trying to make exact predictions about the future, which has so many different factors that nobody can predict. But in terms of general trends, do you see things going in a promising direction? How do you see the future of Iran?
My answer to this question is that I believe it would take time to basically get rid of this mullahs regime, the Islamic establishment, because they keep also resisting, like when a couple of days ago, when they released the news that now we shut down Gashter Shah, this this hijab police. Again, the other few statements went on social media saying that, now we should stop the bank account of those women who remove their hijab, or we come with new policy and we put more restriction on you, hey woman, don't think this is over, things like that. So I believe and the reason is that the Iranian establishment, the Islamic establishment, has since 2011 that got basically no answer to its regime. They made a lot of feet abroad, outside of Iran. So it takes time, for protesters and for the Iranian abroad to come take all these places back, And to me, also this time that the Iranian trying to get back all these resources, it's the time that also they discussing it, they examining what kind of power is going to be alternative. You don't have the immediate answer now, and it shouldn't be. This is a revolutionary process. I think during this process, also within this revolution, the next power also building, So that's why now people are practicing being tolerant to monarchies, to the leftists, to Mujahideen Khalq, to basically to the Kurdish political parties, to maneuver, to examine, to try, to test, to see what is the best for the future.
So experiment with a pluralistic political culture.
Exactly. This is the point. But how this is going to be built, I think the process of revolution itself giving time to do this. This is my basically positive perspective on the revolution, on the current revolution, and the future of it.
Essentially, a part of what you were expressing here, I think, is that we have to be careful not to display this revolution as being over. The fight is not over, and it is like we do have to be realistic in saying that can't be sure that that human rights and freedom is going to win, and this is something that still has to be fought and sacrificed for quite probably for many years to come.
Exactly.
Yeah, and on another level, where will the regime and their supporters go? Maybe Khomeini could go to, I don't know, Venezuela. I don't know what other options he would have, and I hear
It's
Putin's planning to go to Venezuela, but I don't think Venezuela will take 10% of the population of Iran, so 8 million people who support the regime. Or could they, frankly?
You mean in Venezuela or in Iran?
Venezuela.
Oh, well,
So they'll still be in Iran. So the supporters will still be in Iran, and well, they'll still be there, so they can make things difficult after the regime is gone.
I think, I think, I mean, for sure, the Russian, the Chinese, the Syrian, the Iraqi, the Lebanese, the Palestinian would not take them. We all know that, right? So even though they spend a lot of Iranian money there, to keep themselves in power in the region, to play with their rivals, but on any cost for Iranian people. But once the regime fall down, I think probably one of the place they would go is Latin America, because they already built a lot of also real estate there. And because of the state situation, this is one of the assumption being discussed by media these days, by Iranian media these days, that's the place they might go in the future.
Really? It's even in the media?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Because sure, Russia is siding with Islamic Republic right now and buying their weapons. But, well, we don't know if the current regime will still be in place in Russia a year from now, let alone 10. And, well, China's locking up Muslims in camps, and they don't like losers, which is why Venezuela is Putin's backup plan, not China. Or so I read.
Yeah. Before we take this to a close, I do have one, like my last question for you here. What could we do here in the free world to further support the Iranian people?
I think for the people who come to the street every day, for them what is important to be heard, their voice in any languages worldwide. That's very important to them. Worldwide solidarity for the people coming to the street, basically take their life in hand and, courage to come to the street every day. They need every one of us support to be their voices to be heard in different languages. And I think that's very important. And also another thing is that to push, if we can, in any position and job we are, to basically criticize and push the state in Europe, even among Americans, to basically stop collaborating with the Iranian state, the Islamic establishment, and listen to their protests, listen to their demands, and listen to these universal human rights slogans, woman, life, freedom. I think that's very obvious.
Zindagi Azadi. All right. Thank you very much, Kazuma, for coming on the show. We really enjoyed talking to you. And I think both me and Ben, and hopefully our listeners, will have learned a lot from this conversation, both about the situation in Iran, supporting the people of Iran, and how a lot of the aspects that we talked about can be applied, like for example, in terms of civil society in other authoritarian states, where people are suffering injustice around the world. I hope we can continue to further work together for a better world, to stand in solidarity with each other, to learn from each other, for a free Iran and a free world.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for being here. Until next time, everyone, goodbye.
Goodbye.
گریه های بی‌وقفه برای تصویر تکرار این لحظه، برای چهره‌ای که میخنده، برای دانشان تا برای آینده، برای این بهشت اجباری، برای نخبه های زندانی، برای کودکان افغانی، برای همه برای غیر تکراری، برای همه سوالهای تو خالی، برای آباد خونه های پوشالی، برای احساس آرامش، برای خورشید پس از شبای طولانی، برای بورسای اعصاب و بیخوابی، برای مرد ریحان آبادی، برای دختری که آرزو داشت پسر بود، برای زن